artists, today it's time to put the finishing touches on our birch tree watercolor painting. So let's get started.
Artists, this is what you're going to need. You're going to need your paper from last time, which it's dry, the salt has taken its effect, made some nice stars in the sky. You're going to need an eraser. You're going to need some Sharpies. Remember, Sharpies are permanent markers, so do be careful with these. That's why I also have some scrap paper on here. I also have a little bit of water, just a damp cotton swab here. You could also use a paintbrush, but you gotta be very careful not to use too much water. So here's what we're gonna do first. First, I'm gonna try to erase this pencil line that I have going across the horizon. Now, you're not gonna be able to probably get rid of the whole thing, especially if you painted over the top of it, but try to lighten it up as much as you can. And once you get that erased or lightened up a bit, what I want you to do is take your hand and just dust off those eraser crumbs. Then the next thing I want you to do is take that damp, which just means not very wet at all. If your moon has some paint sticking to it, you can take the cotton swab and get just the oil pastel part wet. Don't get the sky wet at all. If you get the sky wet, you're going to end up leaving kind of funny marks on the sky. So then I'm going to take my dry side and wipe off. Now, if you didn't get the whole thing colored in, or if you colored outside, you might notice that the watercolor doesn't stick where the oil pastel is. But if you got a hole, like I missed a little bit there, I just pretend that it's a crater. All right, so the next thing you're gonna do is take your Sharpies. Now, I'm gonna start with the thicker Sharpie, which is actually called a fine point Sharpie. Make sure you put the lid on the back. And the first step to using the Sharpie is to go back and make the line for your birch tree thicker. So I'm just going over that again, not the bottom, just the sides. And if you find that you've got a little space or a gap, go ahead. Now I had a little leaking going on under here. You might notice that happened on your paper. If you do, and you can cover it up a little bit with this thick line, you might not be able to cover up the whole thing. Depends how much leaking you have. So you're probably wondering what caused the leaking to happen. Well, two things can happen. If you didn't have the tape all the way pushed down, sometimes it will soak up underneath. Other times, if you paint too much or you had too much water on your brush, what happens is it soaks underneath the tape. So you don't worry about that if that happened. I'm going to show you some tricks that you can use to cover it up. But first, we're going to talk about the light source again. We use that to help us find where the shadows are going, but there will also be kind of some shadows on the tree. Now, we can't really shade with values like you normally would with pencils. So what I'm going to do with my Sharpie is I'm going to do something called hatching lines. And hatching lines are short lines that go in all the same direction, really close together here because I'm trying to create a shadow. Just going to go all the way up the side. You do need to be careful to stay inside. By making that line thicker, it does make it easier to do this part without going on the outside. So the reason I put my shadow or the hatching lines on this side of my tree is because my moon is shining on this side and the opposite side will be in shadow. Okay, so I'm going to continue doing that on these two trees because the shadow will be on this side. When I get to that other tree, the moon is on the opposite side of the tree. This also can kind of hide some of those leaking watercolors under the tape. So if you've got some of that, that's okay. So now I'm going to switch and put the shadow on this side. So be thinking about where your light source is. I'm trying to get these pretty close to the same size. However, if it's a little bit off and some are shorter or longer, I don't worry too much about that. Okay, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to put some marks on the tree that give the texture of birch trees. Now, they're white trees, but they do have some marks on them that make them have some black. So I'm just going to make some spots, and I still color horizontally. Sometimes I put them in the middle, sometimes I'll put it off to the side. Sometimes this is where a branch has fallen off the birch tree. Now don't try to get them too equally spaced apart. Sometimes you might want to have one that's bigger. This is another great way if you've got a leaky spot where you can cover up some places. So you can make them small, you can make them big right on the edge if you want, or right in the middle. Make sure each of your trees has some of these irregular places, because real birch trees have them too. Now, after I get the big spots done, I'm going to close this marker for just a moment and use my thin Sharpie. And I'm going to use some thin marks on here. Sometimes I like to put them close together. Sometimes I like to leave one place really clean, right, maybe next to my big, thick places. It's very random, and you just have to go by what feels right. The trick is making sure you're using a horizontal stroke with your Sharpie, sometimes varying it, making some places long, some short, maybe just one right here in the middle by itself. This does not have anything to do with the shadows. So I'm just going to put a few of those on each of my trees. And then there's just one last thing that you should do. I'm going to get my big Sharpie out again. And this time, near the top of my trees, I'm imagining that these trees really go on and on forever, and that there's lots of branches up here. But maybe at just the top of our picture, we can show some of the branches that are starting. So I'm going to draw a line that comes out diagonally from the tree. Now, you don't want to leave it just a single line. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and make it a little thicker on the end. I'm going to fill this place in. It doesn't need to be perfectly straight, and sometimes you can make smaller branches coming off of that one. Now I'm going to put a couple of these on each of my trees, and try not to make them match perfectly. Try to make each one just a little different. I often think of these little branches like the letter Y coming off of my tree. And make sure you have 2 or 3, maybe some people like to do a lot of these, but make sure you get at least a couple on each of your trees. And it's even okay if you have them starting kind of in the middle of your branch. Like I started this one right over here. Sometimes then I like to go back with my thin marker, if it is in the middle, and kind of show where that came out of the tree. So once you get all of those black marks and you feel like you've got enough on there, you are finished with this. Remember, you can add more branches if you choose, but make sure each tree has at least 2 or 3. I think that's what I'm going to decide. I'm going to add one more. And I hope you've had fun making this with me today. Remember, stay creative and have an art-tastic day.